Hello there, Drew Hanish of Whiskey Lore, and time for another whiskey tasting and a Matchup Monday, where I take two different whiskeys that I'm curious to see what the differences are between them, and I present them to you, along with some additional information here or there. And both of these are coming from the Bruichladdich Distillery, which is located on Islay, where a lot of whiskey comes from and a lot of peated whiskey comes from. Now, Bruichladdich, they make peated whiskeys and they make unpeated whiskeys. Their peated whiskeys, they do mostly at 40 ppm, and ppm being parts per million of phenols, which doesn't necessarily tell you what it's going to taste like or how heavily peated it is after it's been distilled, because distillation will play with the amount of smokiness in a whiskey. These whiskeys, they say, are trickle distilled. Don't be fooled. It's marketing. Not triple distilled, trickle distilled, which, as I read up on that, the best I can glean from that is that they have tall, slender stills, which are beautiful stills. I've had a chance to see these stills, and they are these, you're used to seeing these glowing, bright copper stills. These are dark stills, and it's a fascinating distillery to go visit if you get a chance to go see it. They make the botanist there also, and they make the botanist in a still called Ugly Betty. And so what's interesting is that this distillery has equipment that is still wooden. It comes from the 1800s. So fascinating distillery to go and visit. They like to keep their whiskeys at around 50% ABV, which is great because you get lots of flavor out of these whiskeys. And Port Charlotte 10 Heavily Peated has been a favorite of mine for an awful long time. But while I was doing an event here in town not too long ago in Greenville, I got to leave with some of these bottles, little mini bottles of Port Charlotte Scottish Barley Heavily Peated Islay Single Malt. And I said, okay, what is the difference between this and this? There's got to be a difference. What could it be? And I tasted this, and I knew it was different, but I couldn't quite put my finger on maybe exactly what the differences were between these two different whiskeys. So I did some research, and I'm going to taste these two side by side and tell you what I have found in these two whiskeys. The most obvious thing is that these two whiskeys, one is non-age stated and the other one has an age statement. So this is a 10-year-old whiskey. This is a non-age stated whiskey. And you may be saying to yourself, oh, okay, so this is a younger whiskey and it's probably not going to be as refined. Well, from what I've read, it appears that Port Charlotte Scottish Barley actually uses whiskeys from 6 to 13 years old. And the first thing that you do is you say, okay, these are not using colors. There's no colorant in these, and they are almost the same color. Now, it's true that when you start to age a whiskey, it picks up a lot of color initially after a few weeks of sitting in the barrel, and then it slowly starts bringing on more and more of its color as it goes. But those are really close to each other. So that tells me that, yes, probably what's in this glass averages out to maybe being around 10 years old as well. The other thing is, where does the barley come from? Well, both of these apparently are using Scottish barley, so it's not coming from France. It's not. But if you know the Bruichladdich brand, you know that they also do Islay barley. So I did a video sometime back where I did a tasting of Scottish barley versus Islay barley versus the barley that is coming from up in Orkney, and tasted the differences, but just to see what the flavor differences were. And there was definitely a marked difference in the different types of barley. So it got the question going in my mind of, this is called Scottish barley, why is that not called Scottish barley? Because they actually are both getting their barley from the same place, which is around Inverness. And so This is a barley that is going to not necessarily have a lot of what I would call seaside character to it. So if there's seaside character, it's probably coming from the aging and the fact that these barrels are aged on the island of Islay. All right, so lots of information there, looking at these two things. Well, the aging is also, apparently they choose a lot of different barrels to make this stuff, the Scottish barley, and the types of barrels that they're using are American oak, virgin oak, meaning that they are being either charred or toasted and then utilized. And then they're also using 2 different French wine casks for what they are aging in here, versus this, which is a little more specific. I could find the actual outlay of different barrels that they were using. So they said 65% first fill ex-bourbon, 10% second fill bourbon, which just means a little less aggressive on the bourbon influence there, 25% French wine casks being used for the rest, and it's the second fill wine casks. 10 years, okay, got all that information. Barley is the same, so let's go in and do a little nosing and tasting on these 2 whiskeys. And I'm going to start with the 10-year because the 10-year is the one that I know and the one that I feel like is probably going to be, even though we said the average of the ages kind of works out, there is some younger whiskey in this particular one. So on the nose on this, the smoke is there. It's not overly pronounced. It's not quite as strong as you might think. There's a little bit of a maritime influence on the nose. Maybe a little heatheriness along with that smoke. It's more of a foresty kind of a smoke that's coming through, and this comes from around the Caledonian forest, and so it's going to probably have more of a woodsy kind of a smoke. There's maybe a little vanilla coming through here, and maybe a little citrus peel coming through. Slight note of barbecue, slight note. Cheers. Silky is always what I put with this. There's almost a fudge characteristic that comes through on this. Little pepper, little citrus coming through towards the end, and then that smoke is there throughout the experience. I actually get a little bit of a coconut kind of a flavor coming through on that as well. Not quite almond joy going on here, but bits of that. And then I get some of the orchard fruit coming through and a little barbecue coming through on the finish as well. Brininess, a little brininess in there as well. The smoke lingers on the palate. It's got a lot of stuff going on. It's just a really, really nice whiskey, and that's why it's one of my favorites. It is not an ashy smoke like Ardbeg. It's not an overly seaweedy smoke like you would get out of a Laphroaig. It's in the Lagavulin neighborhood, but even there can be some... it depends on the age. A little bit more aggressive on the younger Lagavulins than on the older ones. All right, let's try this Scottish Barley and see where we kind of take a turn, or if these are just very similar whiskeys. So the first thing that's apparent to me is there's a little bit of a fingernail polish note to this. And it's not overly strong, but it's definitely there. And then the smoke is more pungent on this whiskey. little bit of a citrus note in there. I don't tend to be pulling in the fudgy kind of characteristic as much on this. I'm really more on, it's kind of got that solvent note. Once you notice it, it's really definitely there. Barbecue notes, all that stuff is really kind of hidden underneath. Cheers. Very different and interesting. The fudge note does come through on the palate, but it's different. The smoke, a little bit more bitter I'm getting on that. A little maybe lemon rind coming through on that. Everything's a little bit more aggressive. The smoke is more out front. There's a lot more pepper on this than there is on the other. This is definitely less, there's less depth in terms of flavor and more in your face with the things that are coming through on this particular whiskey. Yeah, it's still clean on the finish. The smoke, though, it doesn't leave in a hint. It leaves and kind of just dissipates and is gone. So it's not like this. When you get halfway through the tasting on the 10, the smoke is there and it just kind of carries through and it never fully disappears. Whereas this, it's more aggressive, and then maybe that over impact on the palate just brings it down to a point where it just fades away because you were so hit with it up front that you really feel like it's disappeared by the time you get to the end. The lingering residual notes are not here, whereas they are with the 10. The silkiness on the palate, I don't know. I mean, it has that fudgy kind of a character when it first hits the palate. And maybe you kind of get that. You know, I remember actually as a kid, we used to go to Williamsburg, Virginia, and we would go to the fudge shops. My dad loved fudge. And you would get that fudge and it would have kind of this oiliness to it. And you kind of taste that bit of oiliness with the fudge. But it dissipates really quickly. And it's so blended with the smoke that it seems much more aggressive. If you're for more of those aggressive kind of flavors, I think you might appreciate this more. But if you want a more refined experience, I feel like the 10 is where you're going to get that. Coming back to it on the nose, a little more of the barbecue coming through, actually. And I think some of that is, it's a meaty character that's coming through. It's not really like sometimes I get a ham note, you know, smoked ham. It's not that. It's almost more of a beefy characteristic to it. I like it, but it has some rougher edges to it. It's interesting, the fudge actually just pokes on through all of a sudden, as it's like, all right, everything's fighting a little bit for some space in here. The fudge does actually linger on the palate a little bit longer on the second drink. And that's the thing, is sometimes it takes an additional buildup of the whiskey for you to start getting some more of those characteristics coming through. But the fudge actually lingers, and now the smoke is, again, dissipating to very little action there on the finish. So it's not as long a finish as the 10 is, and I don't know, price-wise, I think the Scottish Barley is a little bit more expensive than the 10 is. It's also harder to find. This is their flagship, basically, of the Port Charlotte line. and I'm glad it is because it's a fantastic whiskey, and would love to know your thoughts. Have you had Scottish Barley? Have you had some of the different varieties of Bruichladdich and Port Charlotte? And what is your favorite out of what comes out of the Bruichladdich distillery? Of course, there's Octomore as well, which to me is an experimental whiskey versus these, which are probably more meant to be everyday sippers rather than something that you go, wow, that was fascinating, and now I'm on to something else. Anyway, appreciate you guys watching. Hope you learned something from this. If you did, give me a like. If you haven't watched my videos before, you want some whiskey education along with your tastings, I am always happy to provide. And until next time, which one do I grab? Cheers and Slainte. You know, what's interesting is after drinking this one and then going back to this one, I'm picking up more of the wine cask characteristic out of this, and some of that fruitiness, darker fruits coming through, which I had never really noticed before in Port Charlotte. And there it is in that particular whiskey. Very interesting.